Welcome back into our session in What is the Gospel? And this is the 8th module in a series titled What is the Gospel? And we have defined the gospel. We've been very precise about it. It is the death, the life, the burial, and the resurrection of Jesus Christ going to the cross to specifically pay the price for our sins. Okay? It's the works of Christ on the cross that we ascribe, we obtain to ourselves by grace and faith. Now, the gospel is very specific. It is what Christ has done to remove sin and pay the penalty of sin on our behalf, by which we are incapable of paying on our behalf. Now, in this series, we've been dealing with a number of issues surrounding the gospel, related to the gospel, and these are what are called the secondary issues that become the stumbling blocks for a lot of people. And I'm recalling when I was in Atlanta at the airport there, or on a layover for quite some time, due to weather issues, and I got engaged in a conversation with somebody about the gospel. And it didn't take long for the question, which is the following: who is Jesus Christ? Who is Jesus Christ? It's unlike the question, okay, does God exist? That's a very different question, because very few people question whether Jesus Christ existed. There are very few people question that, okay? Now, they will come up with the issue about, does God exist? So we have to address this issue because the person could not get past who is Jesus Christ. Now, we make the assumption that everybody knows who Jesus Christ is, and that is not necessarily true. But unlike this question about, does God exist, very few people actually question whether Jesus Christ existed. That's not the issue. The issue, but who is he? Whether he existed, that's another issue. So it is generally accepted that Jesus was truly a man who walked on the earth in Israel 2,000 years ago. That's pretty much accepted around the world. I've been in Israel, I have been in Asia, I have been in the Philippines, I have been in Indonesia, I've been in Malaysia, I've been in Korea, I have been all over Africa, in the northern part of Africa, the southern part of Africa, the eastern part of Africa, the western part of Africa, all over Latin America, and in Europe as well. And pretty much the overwhelming majority of people do believe that Jesus Christ did exist 2,000 years ago in Israel, and he was a man who walked on the earth. Now, so that's not in question. Here's where the debate begins, and this was the issue that I was addressing or attempting to address when I was speaking to this gentleman and his wife in the airport in Atlanta, Georgia. The actual debate begins with the subject of Jesus' full deity is discussed. That's when it begins. The discussion, once you get to the discussion that he is God the Son of God, this is where the debate begins to take place. Why? Because almost every major religion teaches that Jesus was a prophet or a good teacher or a godly man. That's pretty much where they have reduced it, okay? Almost every religion has reduced Jesus, okay? Has reduced Jesus to being a prophet, a good moral teacher. Okay? Just think about that. Or he was a godly Now, this is what all the religions, almost everyone, either has him as a prophet, a good moral teacher, or a godly man only. So once you begin to discuss the deity of Jesus Christ, here's where the debate begins. Very different from the question, does God exist? Very different from that kind of a question. So do not confuse both questions. Now, the problem is that the Bible tells us that Jesus was infinitely more than a prophet, more than a good teacher, and more than a godly man. He was more than that. I would like to draw your attention to C.S. Lewis in his book, Mere Christianity, and he writes the following. Now, why do I draw your attention to C.S. Lewis? Well, as I was in the airport speaking to this couple, and it was an older couple, who basically were raised outside of the church. They were Gentiles. They were not Jews. They were Gentiles, but they were raised pretty much as agnostics at best, okay? Claimed to be atheists, almost to the point to claim that they were atheists. They were just basically non-religious. And as I listened to them, and I said, however, but they were very well educated, and they had read C.S. Lewis works. And they did read Mere Christianity, and it was quite confusing to them, having been raised in a very secular situation by which they virtually and in fact intentionally closed their eyes to even what C.S. Lewis had to say. So I whipped out my phone, right? I finally began to learn how to work my phone, right? And as I work out my phone, I realized that a phone is more than a phone. Now it's a mini computer. And I looked up C.S. Lewis, and I said, well, let me share something with you about C.S. Lewis. So C.S. Lewis, in his book, Mere Christianity, he writes the following. He says, I am trying here to prevent anyone from saying the really foolish thing that people often say about him, Jesus Christ. And this is the foolish thing people say. I'm ready to accept Jesus as a great moral teacher, but I don't accept his claim to be God. Given the overwhelming evidence and the preponderance of evidence that's provided, they would still reject that idea. That is the one thing we must not say. A man who was merely a man and said the sort of things that Jesus said would not be a great moral teacher. C.S. Lewis goes on to say he would either be a lunatic on a level with a man who says he is a poached egg, or else he would be the devil of hell himself. You must make your choice. And this is what C.S. Lewis, and I was reading this out loud to them to force them to come to the, you have to make a decision. He says, and C.S. Lewis goes on to say, you must make your choice. Either this man was and is the Son of God, or else a madman or something worse. You can shut him up for a fool. You can spit at him and kill him as a demon, or you can fall at his feet and call him Lord and God. But let us not come up with a patronizing nonsense about his being a great human teacher. He has not left that option open to us. He did not intend to. Nowhere does he even insinuate in any of the writings of all of the scriptures that he is a prophet only, a good moral teacher only, or a godly man only, or all three, and never claim divinity. If you have an honest read of the scriptures. And so once I read that statement out loud to them, and I told them, I said, well, since we have to be here for 3 hours because of the storm at best, and it turned out to be like 7 hours because of the storms. So we had the opportunity. In fact, we even had dinner. We walked down to one of the restaurants in the terminal, and we actually sat down and had dinner and continued the conversation as I was sharing with them. So, who did Jesus claim to be? Because they told me that they believe that he did exist 2,000 years ago, because all the religions say that he is a good moral teacher, he's a prophet, he's a godly man. They accept that the person actually existed. In what form, they were not too sure, but they were sure that he was one of the three, maybe two of the three, at best three of the three. But any claim to divinity didn't make any sense to them. So I said, okay. So as we continue having this long conversation, which was a great conversation, I said, well, who did Jesus claim to be? And so they went and repeated the same thing. I said, no, stop. I didn't ask you what other people claim that he was, or who they claim him to be. I did not ask you what the major religions of the world claim that he is. I asked you, who did he claim to be? I said, would you accept the fact that the Bible is generally accepted as the Word of God, and in that Word he speaks? Who? Jesus. And they said, well, that is the claim. I said, well, then let's find out what he said about himself. Let's find out. I said, well, let me look in. So obviously they didn't have a Bible. Okay, I did. So I whipped my Bible out of my bag. And I told him, I says, well, you have your cell phones, they're mini computers, and they whipped out their cell phones, okay? And almost, you could see them trembling, the fingers were shaking with the idea that they had to look up a Bible. And they found a Bible online, and they looked it up, and I said, just follow me. I said, look what he says. So who does the Bible say? I didn't ask you what Islam says. I didn't ask you what the Roman Catholic says. I didn't ask you what Judaism says. I didn't ask you what Buddha says or Confucius says or anybody else says. I asked you, what does the Bible say about Jesus Christ? So first, let's look at Jesus' words, okay? So I asked him, look at John chapter 10, verse 30. It says, I and the Father are one. I said, that's what he said. I and the Father, who's the Father? God the Father, are one, right? So what does Jesus say? Okay, so let's find out. Who does Jesus say about himself? And we find that in John chapter 10, verse 30. He says that he and the Father are one. That's what he says. Never mind what anybody else says about him. What does he say about himself? That's the question. What does he say about himself? Now, at first glance, this might not seem to be a claim to be God. However, look at the Jews' reaction to his statement. Now, people, and he, just like many who are very intellectual, they say, well, he's not saying that he's God. He's just saying that he and the Father are one. He says, just like my wife and I here. He says, we're one, right? We're married, we're one. But I'm not a woman, she's not a man, but we're one. And I said, that's true. I said, but that's not what he said. I said, so when other people here at the restaurant sitting here and they know that you're married, how would they look at you? They go, well, they will look at you as being one couple, belonging to each other. You have the same name, the same essence of each other now. You've consummated your marriage. You have children. And I says, have you noticed that the longer people stay married together, the more they begin to look like each other. They take on each other's qualities and characteristics and so forth, because that's just natural. You become one. I said, is that what you're saying that Jesus is saying? Well, yeah, pretty much that's what Jesus is saying. I said, okay, well then let me ask you this much. If people here in the restaurant said that they don't believe that you are married, and yet you are, what would be your reaction? Well, that can't be because we are. I said, okay. I said, there's a lady in the other table there, sir, and she's by herself. And if I told everybody here in the restaurant, and I said, well, you and her are married, what would be their reaction? Well, they wouldn't believe it because my wife here would testify that I am married to her. I said, okay. I said, just follow the logic here. I'm not trying to be offensive. I'm not trying to be difficult here. Okay? I'm not trying to be cute here. That's not what I'm trying to do. But I just want you to get your thinking. So the reaction of other people would be a testimony to who you are. I said, well, yeah. I said, so if I asked your children, I said, may I ask you how many children? He says, well, we have 7 children. He said, they're all grown adults and they're all married and they have their own children. We're grandparents. I said, okay, that's wonderful. I said, so if I asked all your parents, all of your children and your grandchildren who you are, would that be a testimony as to who you are? They said, yes. Okay. So let's go back to John chapter 10, verse 30. Jesus said this. He said that I and the Father are one. But what was the reaction of everybody around them? Look at this. Go to John chapter 10. Okay? And look at the Jews' reaction. In John chapter 10, verse 33. Look at this very carefully. They understood clearly what he was saying, in spite of the fact that you and I are 2,000 years removed, but they understood exactly what he was saying. At first glance, this might not seem to be a claim to be God. However, look at the Jews' reaction to his statement. Okay? This is to Jesus' statement. Look, Jesus' reaction to the Jews' reaction. I'm sorry. Let's make this the Jews' reaction to Jesus' statement. What was the, look at it, verse 33, John chapter 10. It says, the Jews answered him, for a good work we do not stone you, because they were looking to stone you. That was the Jews' reply. That's how the Jews replied. Look at this. So he says, but for blasphemy, because you, being a man, make yourself out to be God. The Jews clearly understood that this was Jesus' statement that he was claiming to be God. So who does Jesus say he is? They were not stoning him for the good works that he was doing. They were not trying to stone him for being a prophet. They were not trying to stone him for being a good moral teacher. They were not trying to stone him for being a godly man, because they recognized all those qualities in him. So in John chapter 10, verse 33, the Jews answered him and said, for a good work we do not stone you. That's how the Jews replied. But for blasphemy, and because you, being a man, make yourself out to be God. They understood clearly the language. The Jews understood Jesus' statement as a claim to be God. That's how they understood it. And in the following verses, Jesus never corrects the Jews by saying, no. I did not mean to say that. I did not claim to be God. You never find the entire dialogue in John chapter 10 where Jesus says, no, you're mistaken. I misspoke. You misunderstood me. Let me clarify the issue. Jesus never said any of that. Not whatsoever. He didn't say that. He let it stand exactly as they reacted, because that's exactly what he was saying. He was speaking in their language, in their idiosyncrasies, okay? And they understood it. That indicates what? That Jesus was truly saying he was God by declaring, I and the Father are one. That's very clear. So who does Jesus say he is? Now, let me take you next one. Let me give you another example. Go to John. Now, go to John chapter 8, verse 58. Who did Jesus say? So Jesus said this to them, right? He says, truly, truly, I say to you, before Abraham was born, I am. Jesus said, I am. Before Abraham was born, this is what Jesus is now. Whether you believe the Bible or not, that's a different issue. But this is the transcript, the official transcript of the words of Jesus, of God the Father, and all of the prophets, all of the disciples, all of the apostles. Whether you believe it or not, it's a separate issue. But this is the official transcript of what he said. Whether you accept it or not is another issue. Whether you believe it or not is another issue. We'll deal with that in a moment, but I want you to understand, you can't change what he said or didn't say. Or you can't make it say what it didn't say, and you can't make it not say what it didn't say. So I want you to understand this. So look at this. In John chapter 8, verse 58 is another example where Jesus answered, he said, truly, truly, I say to you, before Abraham was, I am. Again, look at the response of the Jews, okay, who took up stones in an attempt to stone Jesus, okay? Again, so look at, here again, let's go this. So let's go to the Jews' reaction to Jesus' statement. Okay? Look at this. And we're going to go into John chapter 8, verse 59. Look at his reaction. John chapter 8, verse 59. Look at their reaction. They had a clear understanding of what he was saying. Look at this. Again, in response, the Jews took up stones in an attempt to stone Jesus. They said this, John 8:59. Therefore, they picked up stones to throw at him, but Jesus hid himself and went out of the temple. This is immediately after Jesus made the statement, I am. Before Abraham was, I am. Now, you don't understand that. I don't understand that because we don't have a Jewish background. But I am was an exclusive statement that was to Jehovah God. Let me show you this. Jesus was announcing his what? His identity, I am, is a direct application of the Old Testament name for God. So when Jesus made this announcement, okay, what was Jesus doing? Okay, this was Jesus' application of the Old Testament name for God. Go to Exodus chapter 3 and look at verse 14 with me. This is exactly what Jesus was quoting. This was his application of the Old Testament. Look at this. When Jesus was announcing his identity as I am is a direct application of the Old Testament name for God. In Exodus chapter 3 verse 14, he said, God said to Moses, I am who I am. And he said, thus you shall say to the sons of Israel, I am has sent me to you. There is no misunderstanding about the deity, the divinity, of Jesus Christ that he was claiming to be God. There's no misunderstanding. The Jews did not misunderstand it. They understand it very clearly because it was Jesus, a Jew, speaking to Jews. Now, somehow we Gentiles feel that we have the luxury, of just misrepresenting what Jews said to Jews. So again, why would the Jews again want to stone Jesus if he had nothing, if he had not said something, about himself? They believed to be blasphemous, namely claiming to be God. They had a very clear understanding of what he was saying. There was no misunderstanding that. Go with me to John chapter 1. Let's look at this. So in John chapter 1, let's take this in John chapter 1, verse 1. What is happening here in John chapter 1, verse 1? Look at what he says in John chapter 1, verse 1. It says, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. Who is the Word in the Bible? Jesus. The only one that is called the Logos, the Logos, the Word, is Jesus. He says, the Word was God. Who is the Word? Jesus. There is no misunderstanding. He himself is making the direct application. Now, go to John chapter 1 and go to verse 14 and look at what he does again. He says, and the Word became flesh and dwelt among us, and we saw his glory, in the glory of the only begotten from the Father, full of grace and truth. So here we have where he says that the Word became flesh. Okay? Well, who's the flesh? Jesus. Jesus. So this clearly indicates, okay, that Jesus is God in the flesh. There's no misunderstanding this. Now, whether you accept that as truth or you reject that as a lie is a separate issue. But what you cannot do is you cannot negate the truth of the Word of God. You can reject that truth, but you cannot negate that it was stated as truth. That's the profound difference. And we get caught up in so-called semantics and we play with words. No, 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 no. If you said X, Y, and Z, I cannot deny that you said X, Y, and Z. My question is, in what context are you speaking X, Y, and Z? And then when the context clearly indicates that you said what you said exactly the way you said it for the reasons why you said it, okay, now I have to make a decision. Either I accept it or reject it. But I cannot deny it. And that's the profound difference. That is the profound difference. So when we're asking this question as to who is Jesus Christ, it's a profoundly different question from does God exist? Because very few people question whether Jesus Christ existed, because for more than 2,000 years, all of the major religions and in all of the historical books, okay, make a reference that there was a man called Jesus Christ. He was a prophet. He was a good moral teacher. He was a godly man. And many of them also will quote and state that he had claimed to be God. Now, whether they accepted that or not is another issue. The preponderance of evidence over and over and over again, now you have to deal with that issue. So this clearly indicates that Jesus is God in the flesh. Now, you remember Thomas. Thomas, the disciple, declared to Jesus, right? And so let's go to Thomas. Now, we go to Thomas, right? Now, here's the man who didn't believe anything, right? And Thomas, okay, recognize this in John chapter 20, verse 28. So we go to John chapter 20. And what does Thomas say? Thomas says, my Lord and my God. Thomas said, my Lord and my God. Now, doubting Thomas is the man who didn't believe anything. He didn't believe in the wind. He says in John chapter 20, verse 20, he says, so Thomas, and this is what he declared to Jesus. He was speaking directly to Jesus when Jesus appeared to him. And Thomas answered and said to him, my Lord and my God. He made a declaration openly about who Jesus is. So when we ask the question, who is Jesus Christ? And so I'm having this dinner and I'm talking to these people and I'm working my way through it very slowly. And now, you know, it's rarely this ever happens. Rarely, okay? I mean, it turned out to be now 7 hours, 6 plus, almost 7 hours. We were sitting in the airport because of the storms, okay? We couldn't go anywhere. It's in the middle of the winter. There were not exactly like hotels available now. They had already been booked out, okay? And taken up. So we just had to wait out this storm, right? And so we wound up having this long conversation about this issue, in which, you know, rarely people give you that kind of time. They weren't going anywhere. And now they, now they got interested. It piqued their interest. I said, well, let's find out, because it turned out that this man was a professor. And he said he was a professor, okay, of philosophy. And so it was a great conversation because it now it required some analytical thought as to what we were sharing with them. And in no time does Jesus ever correct Thomas. Jesus never corrected Thomas. At no time did he ever do that. So again, what does Jesus say about himself that's written and is recorded in Holy Writ in the Scriptures? Whether you accept the Scriptures or not is another issue. But you cannot deny what he said about himself. And that's the issue that we have to drill down on, okay? Who is Jesus Christ? Because this question comes up over and over and over and over again. Who is he? And the Bible answers that question for every single one of us who really wants to know.